Okay. So this is John Doxey of the Telegraph Hill Dwellers Oral History Project, sitting with Howard Wong. It's November 11th, 2024, and we're at Howard's home at 126 Varenne Street.
Correct.
This is the home that you grew up in, right?
Most of my life.
Most of your life?
Grew up in North Beach. I was born in Chinese Hospital on Jackson Street in Chinatown, and lived on Montgomery Street until the age about 4 or 5. Moved onto this street in a building across the street, and then in about 1952, my parents bought this house.
What year were you born?
1948.
And what was do you recall the street that you initially grew up on?
It was Montgomery near Broadway. There's still a building there. It's a multi-unit building right there near a lot of the nightclubs, although I was too young to know anything about nightclubs.
And so your parents came to Varenne Street, but not to this one across the street?
Right, across the street, which is one of the oldest buildings in the city, in the district, actually. If you look behind all these facade, there's actually a very old building behind it.
And from whom did your parents buy the place?
Well, this house has only 2 owners. So if you look in the way back into the Sanborn maps, you'll see the name assigned to this house was Rossi. So it was an Italian gentleman. So I don't know if he built the house, but he was the first owner. And it was built around 1914, like many buildings in this area, progressively built after 1906 earthquake. And so my father, living across the street, probably had a really friendship with the owner, and he was able to buy this building. So we were one of the first, if not the first, Chinese American families to own property in this area.
From where did your parents come?
My parents, like many immigrants of the post-World War II baby boom, came from southern China, from a city named Toisan. Toisan was a very common place for immigration in the 1920s and 30s because of famine and extreme poverty. So many Chinese in San Francisco in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s came from Guangzhou, southern China.
They were Cantonese speakers?
Yes, mostly all Cantonese speakers in San Francisco. And in particular, Toisan was a very big source of immigration. And my grandfather came into this country in 1914, and he was one of the first to come to the United States. So in his vicinity of China, he was actually kind of a little bit of a mini celebrity because he took that big chance, moved here alone, like many Chinese men at the time.
Did he have a wife who followed him here, or?
No, a lot of the immigrants their families didn't follow them. Their objective was to come here, make money, get some income, send the money back to impoverished people in China, and then someday they would return. But in many cases, many of those people who came here never did return, for many reasons, probably because they needed that flow of income, but also because it was probably too expensive to return, since their objective was to provide funding for their larger extended family back in China.
And is the reason that your parents came to San Francisco because they already had a family member here, the grandfather?
My grandfather was a kind of a pioneer immigrant because he had no one here. And so he came here kind of like many Chinese American or many immigrants to the United States with very little money, and it was with that hope of a better life, some income, to return to their homeland. But they didn't really know what was in store for them. So in a way, it must have been pretty frightening. So, but it was necessity that drove a lot of Chinese out of to, seek better fortune.
At what age were your parents when they arrived here?
Well, my father came here after my grandfather came in 1914. He settled, I think, in Stockton, California. And my father came, I'm not sure what year, probably in the 1930s. And he went to Stockton for a little while. Then my grandfather moved to Sacramento to work in the fruit fields. He was a fruit picker most of his life. And my father followed there, didn't like it, I don't believe. Somehow came to San Francisco, started working in different types of businesses like dry cleaning for most of his life. And worked in Chinatown in the dry cleaner. And then later on in his life, he and two friends bought a business, dry cleaning business in the Richmond district in San Francisco. So it's kind of a very typical story about immigrants.
Where was his initial location, the laundromat business?
Well, in Chinatown, there was a dry cleaner and cleaner on Jackson Street, I believe. It was called Sun Cleaners. So it was a pretty successful business in Chinatown, owned by someone named Bob Chan. And he had quite a good-sized staff in those days. Cleaners had pretty large staffs. Everything was done by hand. A lot of it was, labor-intensive. My father was, one of his roles was driving dry cleaning and cleaning routes. He would take, there would be clients across the city who would send their dry cleaning to the Chinatown dry cleaner, and he would go deliver and pick up from all over the city. So later when he started his own business on Balboa Street in San Francisco, that part of the job, a lot of that was done by him also, the client contacts and the subcontracting to a lot of different outlets who wanted a centralized dry cleaning service.
When he came to San Francisco, I think San Francisco was pretty unique in having a Chinatown district, right? There was no Chinatown in Oakland at that time.
No.
Or Chinatown in the Richmond, or it was really just here, wasn't it?
Yeah, Chinatown in San Francisco, that area bordered by Broadway and Pine, Kearny and Stockton, that vicinity was the only Chinese American Chinatown in the United States. So at that time, in the 1800s, Chinese were essentially, if not by law, by economics and politics, were confined to this area called Chinatown. And there are maps of Chinatown going back to the 1880s that actually map out every establishment type, so you could see on this map, whether it's a grocer or importer or opium den or a cleaner or cigar making factory or any type of service. Chinatown was a self-contained village and town that offered entertainment, theaters, opera, Chinese opera, food, dry goods, herbs, anything was found within that community, and people never really ventured out of Chinatown. So moving, our family, as the first few families that moved into North Beach, were really looked at as kind of, truly foreigners. And we're very welcome.
Like his
in a lot of ways. And so, growing up here, the Italian kids certainly didn't welcome you. And it was kind of, you feared to walk out or fear of getting, taunted or or attacked even. So it was kind of a lot of friction between different ethnic groups in North Beach in the 1950s.
You and or your family make some connections though with the Italian community?
Yeah, I think as you grow up, definitely people got to know each other, and there were a lot of other there was a mixture of ethnic groups in this street. There were French people next door, which was interesting because Varennes, the street name, is a city in France, named after a city in France, where Louis XIV and Queen Marie Antoinette were captured by the revolutionaries. Before the name Varennes for the street, the early maps of San Francisco showed that the name was Lafayette Street. So this street has a French historical connection. And many other alleys in the area, of course, are named after like Genoa or, so there's a lot of ethnic names in our streets here. So this street was a pretty interesting mixture of peoples. There were obviously the Italian grocery at the corner. We became pretty well acquainted and good friends with. And there were, a kid across the street, Italian kid I became a good friend of, Ralph. So as time went by, you certainly developed relationships. But the frictions of ethnic frictions continued well into the 50s and 60s. At one time, there were actually gangs of ethnic groups. So there were Chinese gangs, Italian gangs. And one time, remember, there was at Francisco Middle School, there was a rumor spreading around the school there would be a big fight between the Italian and Chinese gangs in the afternoon. So suddenly everyone was gathering.
Where was it going to
at
be?
North Beach Playground. So there were it must have been 100 people there. I remember everyone's waiting for this big fight. But the police came, so the fight never occurred. But there were, it was interesting, it was kind of a West Side Stories. The 60s, you actually did see gangs with their own jackets and colors. And it was kind of an interesting, when you think back today, it was kind of like people trying to stake out their turf in a way by uniting and defending themselves or fighting others.
Was Broadway a dividing line?
Broadway was a dividing line. So living in North Beach, if I walked on the street from North Beach towards Broadway, it wasn't unusual to sometimes get a stare or a taunt, like Chinamen or something like that. Even on the bus, riding the dirty Stockton as a child, you would sometimes get some racial taunts.
Now, I imagine that since you grew up in North Beach and it's so close to Chinatown, that you would go into Chinatown to do shopping and things.
Yeah,
too,
I think all Chinese, not only in this area, but Chinatown in the who knows for how long, certainly in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Chinatown was a necessary cultural hub for Chinese America. And the food, the products were only found in Chinatown. So it wasn't unusual to go to Chinatown, say, on a Saturday morning. And Chinatown's main shopping street, Grand Avenue at that time, between, say, Broadway and Washington, that stretch of Grand was kind of a central center of Chinese American goods and products. So you would see people from Hawaii, and you could tell they were kind of Hawaiian, carrying like bags and bags of products.
Things that they couldn't find in Hawaii.
That's right, they were bringing it back. And that was probably true of many Chinese all over the country. If they came to San Francisco, they would load up on very difficult to find dry goods or other products and bring them back to whatever. Over time, of course, Chinatown not only spread and proliferated in San Francisco. Now we have many Chinatowns in the Richmond district, the sunset, the Excelsior, over the city, and then Chinatowns in San Jose, Oakland, Seattle, you name it. There are more Chinese restaurants in the United States than all the fast food chains combined. It's kind of a little mini cultural influence, culinary arts of China.
Did you, so you, growing up, you had a friend from the neighborhood named Ralph that you mentioned? And,
Yeah.
And you went to local schools, right? What schools
Yeah.
did you go to?
So I went to all the local schools. So Garfield School up the street, which is right at the end of Maren's. Garfield, when it was first built, was one big giant building. It looked like a giant mansion perched at the base of Telegraph Hill. So that was where I went to grammar school, and it was kind of a nice mixture of different ethnic groups, Chinese, Italian, others. Went to Francisco Middle School when it was first remodeled and they expanded, so I was in the new wing at that time on Francisco, on Chestnut near Francisco. And it was a brand new school, so that was kind of a very nice feeling to be in a new building. And at the time, I was very impressed being in this shiny new school. And there was a new library in the area too, in the 50s, the North Beach Library when it was new. And that was very impressive. So I think being in those two very new buildings, and they were very modern at the time, very, very modern, probably influenced me to become an architect, I think, over time, because I remember them so vividly being in those buildings. Then I later went to high school at Galileo High School, which is our big high school in the northeast part of San Francisco. And that was kind of an interesting mix of peoples. And it was probably mostly Chinese kids, and it was not unusual to be in a math or science class. It was 100% Chinese, and even the teacher sometimes was Chinese.
Were the Italian kids going there too?
They were, but somehow the Asian kids always seemed to get channeled into science and math. So it was not unusual to have a math class with all Chinese kids. And that was, so I never felt that I was a minority growing up. So that was the good thing about going to Galileo at that time, because you never felt that you were, you were different. You were kind of actually the dominant cultural group. So after Galileo, I went to San Francisco State University I got a degree in math.
Was it at Galileo that you began to develop an interest in math then?
Yeah, I think so. I think in Francisco Middle School and Galileo High School, math and sciences seemed to be much easier for me, and I think a lot of Asian kids, for whatever reason. Maybe because language and arts and other things were kind of more difficult, right? Being a foreign, I was first generation born, but still obviously parents did not speak the language, so your inclination seemed to be math. So being good at math, that kind of led me to major in math in San Francisco State.
Did you have an idea of what you might do with a math degree?
No, I didn't. That was the, in junior high school and high school, for whatever reasons, teachers always ask kids what do they want to be when they grow up. I think that's kind of a undue pressure because kids growing up in an immigrant family kind of look blankly. What do you mean? What am I going to do? I don't know. So most kids would say, I want to be a teacher, because that was the only thing they saw before their eyes that seemed to be a career. I had no clue what an architect was, or an engineer, or any other profession. So I always used to say teacher, and so anytime someone would say something, I want to be a physicist or doctor, gee, what are those? How do you get there? So it was kind of So when going to San Francisco State math, obviously very good at it, so I had no problems, did well. So then I applied.
What were your years at San Francisco State?
1966 to 1970.
That was quite an interesting time there.
It was kind of interesting. Galileo, the thing that associated with Galileo at the time was the construction of Fontana Towers was occurring. So growing up, attending Galileo, when you sat in the football bleachers for assemblies, you would look at all these towers going up, and one time the contractors were waving, and I remember. Of course, now we look at that tower as kind of a, horrible thing blocking the view, but at the time it said, "Wow, nice new building." You didn't think about what it was obscuring.
Right. Fortunately, they stopped it too.
Yeah, there was a big high-rise and freeway battle going on, but as a kid or a young person, you didn't really know too much about that, or I didn't know too much about it at the time.
Am I right in understanding your years at SF State were 66 to 70?
Yes, about 66
and wasn't
to
there
70.
a lot of civil rights movements?
That was the overlap. That was the big ethnic studies and emergence of ethnic power, political power. It was the baby boom generation all across the country, kind of flexing their majority power. It was a huge group. There was a sense that education wasn't geared for their needs, and there was a fight to create more ethnic studies, and there was marches, and we all remember the anti-war sentiment at the time. So there was San Francisco State had this huge student strike. So in the early days of the strike, I was being very studious. I kind of said, "Gee, you don't want to, not be part of class." So I never really got involved. But then later, as I started hearing more of the issues, I started to join the marchers and strikers. But one of the big things I remember San Francisco State was the Kent State shootings in that university where students were shot by National Guard protesting the war. So I remember that day it was a pretty somber day on campus. So the, student strikes at the time when you're involved, and you remember S.I. Hayakawa, the president of the school at the time, this bitter friction. At the time, you didn't realize how historically seminal it was, because it led to some very important things, which is ethnic identities of Asians, the establishment of Asian studies, Afro-American studies, Hispanic studies.
It was really a leading edge school for that, I believe.
I think it was. I think San Francisco State, UC Berkeley, the Bay Area was a very important part of ethnic identity in education, and the, more opportunities, I guess, for understanding one's own culture and not have it kind of disappeared from academia. So today I think we have a much better balance of the recognition of different peoples in our society who have contributed to the society.
Would you say that experience had a lasting impact on you and kind of shaped a lot of the things you've done subsequent?
I think, I think a lot of perhaps baby boomers, or even today, Chinese American families, and perhaps all ethnic families, have this kind of a conservative outlook. They're basically looking at economics, welfare of growing up, getting successful jobs, success. I think the political shaping of San Francisco State, UC Berkeley, where I later went to school, probably because of the general atmosphere of the schools, social consciousness was kind of part of the upbringing of academia for me at that time, for a lot of other people. So there's this undercurrent. And architecture school in Berkeley, for instance, had a very, very strong social activism, social contribution component to its curriculum, and you didn't realize it at the time. But the school's actual curriculum actually stressed how architecture should benefit people. So there were classes about low-income housing, social components of architecture, even had sociology as part of the architectural curriculum, which at the time you didn't realize it was fairly novel, but it was, so it was integral to what you did.
Just wanted to get the time frame. So did you you completed a degree a bachelor's degree in mathematics at SF State?
Yes.
And did you go directly on to a master's program at Berkeley?
Well, at the interestingly enough, as I was growing up, architecture was a completely alien. So when I was going to through junior high school, I remember very vividly, and this is kind of perhaps an indicator of my inclinations, was in one of these General Assembly career days. And so there were different speakers. And one gentleman stood up and he was talking about himself as an architect. I said, "Oh, what's that?" So he was presenting about buildings, and I said, "Gee, that's very interesting." So I noticed that over in middle school, I always seemed to like to draw pictures of buildings. So that stuck in my mind. Then later, there were other career days. I think in high school, I crossed paths again with a career day, presentation of an architect. And then at San Francisco State, while I was studying math, there was I took this course where in the general auditorium every week, or whenever the class was in session, there was a presentation by different types of artists, different kind of creative people. And again, there was an architect who presented, and that kind of, again, resonated with me. So then when I, being good at math, I got it went to Berkeley in the graduate program for math. So in the first quarter I was at Berkeley in a math class. I was sitting there very despondent because I didn't know exactly why I was studying math. Because it had I didn't have a sense of where I was going with it other than perhaps teaching math. So on a whim, the next quarter I took some architecture classes. I can't remember if it was for credit. I think it was for credit, and I might have sat in on some without credit. But I was kind of surprised. First of all, it was very enjoyable, and you didn't have to do much work. Math is not something that you sit in class and then you go home. You have to do a lot of homework, a lot of problems solving, a lot of reading, a lot of study outside of class. Architecture wasn't like that. It was, if you took architectural history or planning, it was very, very easy. And it came very simple. It was very enjoyable. So then following quarter, I just took all architecture classes. And my counselor in the math department said, "I notice you're not taking any math." I said, "Well, I think I'm going to try to switch majors."
So, what year was it that you completed your Berkeley education?
So I graduated from Berkeley Graduate School in Architecture in 1975.
And did you go on to work at HOK then?
Yeah, so for there about 3-4 years I was at HOK.
In San Francisco?
Yeah, I mostly, and they had started an Oakland office, so I was in Oakland working on their new courthouse and detention center. So that was kind of a lot of things in my career, as you can see, were good happenstance, good strokes of fortune, some meeting people at the right time or hearing about things at the right time. And otherwise, I could very well be teaching math today or something else. But it was a fortunate, because I think one thing about being an architect is somehow people, whatever reason, and it's more than just the eyeglasses. They say, "Are you an architect?" Somehow there's something about the way you approach things. I think I found the perfect fit.
That's great. So how many years, I believe you had a period where you worked in private firms, and then you
Yes.
ultimately went and worked for the city of San Francisco, correct?
That's correct. So the half my career, I worked in different firms, HOK being one. I worked at ELS Design Group in Berkeley, which is one of my former professors' firms, for about 4 years. And actually I learned a lot about, when you're in architecture school, you're just scratching the surface of knowledge about the field. You know, one of the criticisms of the Berkeley curriculum is that it's too heavily focused on social theory, and which I think in hindsight, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at a lot of the socially conscious architecture in the Bay Area, a lot of it stems from that type of, socially imbued sensitivities, I guess you would call it, in the studies. It's not just the nuts and bolts, which you might find in a more technical school. The criticism of not having the technical skills at Berkeley is well founded, because I think a lot of people who graduate are not equipped really to do the technical things of the field, so they don't necessarily get into the mainstream of architecture, but they become, of course, they find other avenues for their education. However, the ones that do enter the field of architecture from Berkeley, I think, provide a lot of really good human interest, addressing the human needs of architecture.
I imagine that because you had come into architecture with the math skills already, that maybe you had more of the technical
Yes.
prowess.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, because in engineering classes, for instance, a lot of my classmates did look to me as somewhat of a expert. So I even tutored classmates. We had little study groups, and I was the tutor on engineering, which was obviously much more easy for me, with equations, structural equations, calculations. So that was it was an important skill. So then I went on and worked in several firms, and I really think working in a small firm of 5 people really gave me a lot more abilities on the technical side of architecture, because you had to do more things.
Were you, sorry to interrupt, during this period doing most of your projects when you were in the private sector in the San Francisco Bay Area, or were you doing things all over?
Yeah, I was always in the Bay Area. So I worked in San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, and I worked for a developer in San Francisco on a Chinese hotel. I worked in the Ferry Building for an architect on movie theaters and cost plus retail stores. And then again, there was this happenstance again in life. Once I worked with a colleague who later I learned was working at the City and County of San Francisco, the Bureau of Architects. I said, oh, what's that about? So he was telling me about government had, architects. I said, I never knew that. Years later, I was bumped into somebody at a Chinese restaurant. I worked with him. He said, oh, I'm working at the Bureau of Architecture. I said, oh, how do you like it? He was telling me about pension plans and things. I said, wow, you can get a pension?
Very steady income, predictable income.
Very steady. So I applied, and then 2 years later, I got a note. Said, oh, we're interviewing. So I interviewed, got an offer, and went to the city of San Francisco thinking, oh, okay, should be much more relaxing, because in private practice, it's somewhat, and it could be intense. There are a lot of deadlines that you have to work, many overtime hours. So I said, well, okay, I won't have to do all this overtime. It'll be much more 9 to 5. Well, it didn't turn out that way. Public architecture actually is much more stressful. And one of the reasons is that you're not working on 1 or 2 projects or 3 projects. You're working on many, many projects all at the same time.
What are some of the city departments for whom you design projects? I think you said that you had done stuff for municipal transportation and at the airport and Parks and Rec, and what are some of the projects that you work on?
Well, there are, as I mentioned, the city has something like 500 to 700 buildings. It's probably the biggest building owners in the city. And the projects I started with included, my first big project was the animal care and control, was the animal shelter renovations, which was kind of a new state-of-the-art animal shelter. Then I went on.
Where is that located?
That's located on Treat Avenue near Harrison and Treat. And at the time, it was considered a state-of-the-art facility. So it's kind of interesting to learn all about 100% hygienic conditions. So it was and it was one of these accelerated projects that had to be done within 6 months. It was an incredible schedule. So was.
And what year was it, or period of time that you were
This
working?
was like 1984 or something like that. So that first introduction to the public realm was not a 9 to 5 job. And while I was doing that, I was working on several other small projects as well. So then over time, I over the 17 years I was with the Bureau of Architecture, there was a range of projects. Some of the my best clients I thought were the airport. And I did some one of their major
Was it a
parking structures. I worked on rental car facilities, their ADA disability master plan. I also worked for other transportation components of the city, the municipal railway, Muni. Worked on some of their maintenance facilities, one of their new facilities. I worked with the parking and traffic department, which was separate from the Time Muni. I worked on some of their parking structures and renovations of parking structures. And so that kind of led me into interest in transportation, which I still really enjoy being involved with, public transit advocacy and things like that. And I worked on Recreation Park. I did a series of renovations for Candlestick Park at the time, the previous stadium, and brought the stadium up to 70,000 seats to host the future Super Bowl, which it did ultimately afterwards. And other important things that I liked were, or not important, but things I liked were performing arts. I worked on the Opera House, the Veterans Building, parts of City Hall. And I think the major highlight of what I did in public realm was historic restoration and historic renovations. So I worked in several historic buildings, which I think became kind of my other focus and interest area. The Spreckles Temple of Music, the Sharon Building, Gogi Park, the Conservatory of Flowers. And so I kind of had a real interest in historic buildings. Unfortunately, some of our public buildings by other people in our bureau were done so poorly that it was kind of horrible to be part of an agency that really desecrated some of our historic buildings at the time. Fortunately, I don't think that's possible anymore because of the oversight of Historic Preservation Commission and other entities who have much more of a legal oversight of
as
some
your
of our buildings.
seniority rose in the city architecture bureaucracy, you became a senior
Yes.
architect?
Yes,
Did that mean that you would oversee these projects?
Yeah, as my career advanced, I became a senior architect and then a principal architect. So it became much more management at some point, which was actually things I didn't enjoy. So, and unfortunately, in public realm, you don't always have a chance to select your employees. So there were some employees that I had to oversee that were problematic, and it was not easy to get work done in a level that you would want. So I kind of tended to find myself doing a lot of work outside the office, preparing the base work for others. So that became extremely tiring. So,
where was your office? Where was the?
Well, the Bureau of Architecture in the late 80s started at the 45 Hyde, which was a 3-story wooden building built for World War II military use. It's a very quaint building. It was kind of a very high ceilings, a lot of light, kind of a woodsy, almost barrack-like building, but it had a lot of charm and character. It was right behind the old main library, which is now the Asian Art Museum. And it was torn down in the 90s for the Asian Art Museum addition. And then later the Bureau of Architecture moved to 30 Van Ness, which is now an big empty hole in the ground for a high-rise development. And that's located at Van Ness and Fell, right between Fell and Market. That was a very nice location. And a building that was not very, it was a pretty typical 60s building, I guess.
Were you at the 45 Hyde building during the 89 earthquake?
Yes, I was. It was a pretty interesting moment. October, was it 17th?
October 17th, 89.
It was at 5 p.m. So suddenly the building started shaking. So I'm in this little office, glass walls, and so I said, oh boy. So it kept shaking, so I stood under the door. That was a mistake. And later I realized I'm standing right under a glass transom. So everybody was looking at each other saying, whoa, when's this going to stop? Fortunately, the building is old, but it's wood frame, wood trusses, so you could hear the creaking, but it was pretty flexible, so nothing happened. So it's kind of an interesting day. I remember the first thing I said, gee, I better walk through the downtown and Chinatown and see how much damage. So I walked down Market, walked down Grant towards North Beach, and I was surprised that I didn't see much damage. Just a little plaster here and there. I said, wow, that was pretty pretty amazing. Nothing really terrible happened, but of course later we heard there were some serious
in the marina
collapses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's really nice in the public sector that you get such a broad array of projects, don't you?
Yeah, that was the real kind of opportunity and challenge. You know, you would find things in realms of work that you would never find in a normal office, which would focus oftentimes architectural offices become specialists. And unless you're in a big firm, then you might have a range. But even then, the range could be somewhat select. It could be, you know, hotels or high-rises or you know, libraries or something, housing. In the public sector, you have every conceivable part of city life is, you know, the city has some aspect of, you know, from the social services to the senior services to animal services, the transit, airports, schools, libraries, police, fire. You know, I worked on the things at San Francisco General Hospital. I worked on this infant resuscitation room. You know, who ever heard of that, right? And that was kind of interesting. And so, and of course, as I mentioned, it just became really, you know, enamored with historic preservation.
So after, I think you said 17 years with the city, you took the opportunity to retire, is that correct?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the stress of so many jobs, managing some people, including some very challenging employees. So the pressure was getting just unbelievably heavy. So I wasn't always enjoying what I was doing, which is, you know, like any architect, rather be designing things rather than managing budgets. So the city had before then some early retirement opportunities. So there was a sense that there would not ever be an early retirement offer again because the previous ones had failed. It didn't decrease the number of employees. However, there was a budget crisis. In it was what year was that? It was 2004 or something like that. So they offered an early retirement. So I took the offer to retire. However, unfortunately, the economy plummeted. Interest rates dropped to 3 or 2% or 1%. So it wasn't as easy a retirement, but it was still, you know, don't regret it. Opportunity then, so I became much more active in neighborhood, community, and public service.
Well, that's what I was going to get to. It seems you have been very active in your post-professional career.
Yeah, I think that's been what I've enjoyed the most, being part of different types of groups. And with my interest in public transit in particular, I helped founded a group called Save Muni, which is a transit advocacy group. I was on the first Muni Citizens Advisory Group when it was still not an official group. It was a group that was formed to advocate for funding for transit, which was one of the first times citizen groups started advocating for funding for Muni. I joined the Trans-Bay Joint Powers Authorities Citizens Advisory Group.
Do you drive a car?
Yeah, I do, but I don't drive as much anymore.
You're an avid Muni user.
Yeah, I'm a more or less 99.5% Muni rider. So I'm just love exploring transit anywhere I go. So that if I travel to another city, one thing I always like to do is ride their transit and try to get everywhere by transit.
And you're on Telegraph Hill Dwellers Transportation Committee.
Yes. I'm on the third stint as chair of the Telegraph Hill Dwellers Transportation Committee. So that's been also a very kind of a important educational tool or component of my neighborhood activism, advocacy. Telegraph Hill Dwellers has had, as you know, some very well-known people in its history. People you really can learn from. People who have been active and important in San Francisco and the neighborhood. So I learned a lot about law, about neighborhood, all the variation, the things that make a neighborhood work. And the Transportation Committee has always been very active with a lot of really good leaders. And we've, over the years, several times had worked to help save the Quite 39 bus, for instance, from either elimination or service cuts. And it's, it's something that it's a big part of this neighborhood, and encourage everyone to be part of that.
You worked on at least a couple that I know about. Maybe there's more that you'd like to share, but the Pioneer Park.
Yeah, that was an interesting project. In 1995, Recreation Park was announcing that they wanted to build some cyclone fencing along Telegraph Hill Boulevard. Because there were too many people trying to climb up and down the hill and posing safety concerns. Perhaps there were some accidents. People were, especially European tourists, like to hike down that steep, rocky hill from Quake Tower down or up to Telegraph Hill Boulevard, and then of course there was oncoming traffic. So a lot of people said, yeah, that sounds awful to build cyclone fencing. So I was up there one day and standing at the top of the Filbert steps looking at this steep incline and watching people, sure enough, climbing down, sometimes carrying children. I said, gee, I can see the danger. And so I was thinking and looking at the hill and said, why isn't there a stairway coming up that hill? That seems like obvious. So I did a drawing in November of 1995 showing a stairway up from Telegraph Hill Boulevard at Filbert, and another stairway extending the stairway at Greenwich up to Quake Tower, and then building a south terrace at the south end side of Quake Tower with some additional smaller stairs. So I did these couple of pages at the December 95 Telegraph Hill Dwellers Christmas party at the Julius Castle. After the late in the evening, I cornered Mia Farrell, the president of THD, and another person, I can't remember who it was, and we sat down and said, I wanted to show you this drawing. Instead of a cyclone fence, we could have a rec park build some stairways. She said, this is a great idea. So she convened a meeting and invited a lot of Telegraph Hill dwellers. And one of them was at a house facing that hill. And so this group, everybody looked at it. Makes sense, why wouldn't it? So we proposed that to Rec Park. Rec Park did not have the money. And then, so thereby, Telegraph Hillers formed this group, started forming these formal meetings to see what we could do to advocate for and raise money. And that spun off into a group that for 5 years called the Pioneer Park Project. Met regularly from 1995 to 2001, raised money, advocated with politicians, created public-private partnerships. So we had, all kinds of fundraisers, events, art auctions, functions. We spoke at public bodies like the Metropolitan Transportation Commission to get money, spoke with the Transportation Authority to get money, and were able to, and partnered, very importantly, with the Bureau of Landscape Architecture, the Public Works Department, got one of their landscape architect who's a friend of mine to start coming to our meetings on his own time at first. And then as we started building this funding and reached over $1 million, we were able to get with the Public Works Department, their department that assumed to complete the drawings that we had started. So the project design initiated here in the community, and we did the design, initial design, with volunteer architects, landscape architects. There. But more importantly, it also created the ADA disability access through the South Terrace. The city was legally bound to do anyway. So our project fulfilled a legal obligation. Interestingly enough, during the about 1998, somewhere thereabouts, and after the community had designed this project with multiple stairways, South Terrace, ADA accessible ramp from the north parking lot around the new terrace into Quay Tower. At that time, before the final started, the formal working drawings were to start, I knew we needed to get the original drawings of Quay Tower. So the Bureau of Architecture has a vault that's kind of a, old safe, looks like an old safe. So I went there, found the original drawings of Quay Tower from 1932, and I started to look at them. And it was kind of interesting. I said, wait a minute, what is this? There were some...
they had stairs?
There were some drawings, and the drawings showed the south stairway that we intended. It looked a little different, but it was pretty close. It showed a stairway extending from the Greenwich steps that looked pretty close to what we were doing, and had a south terrace. Instead of our oval terrace, it had a rectangular terrace. These are drawings by Arthur Brown, the original architect. So I looked at it and said, wow, what in the world? And it said they were called alternates. Alternates in bidding are things that if you have enough money, you would build. So the original drawings actually included all the stairways that we had envisioned and a terrace, south terrace. So our campaign then became following in the footsteps of history.
Right. Kind of completing the original design.
Yeah, so this is amazing. So we all looked at these drawings, and then we started creating drawings showing this was what was built, this was what Arthur Brown had intended, and this is what we're doing. So there was this lineage of history. So great minds think alike, we said.
That's a great story, a great project. Maybe less happy story, and interesting that you talked about the North Beach Library as a child, and I think you were quite involved in when that renovation.
Yes, I was. Well, the history of that area, it actually precedes the library project itself. I forgot exactly what year, but there was a big land use battle in our neighborhood. The corner of Columbus and Lombard, where the new North Beach Library stands today, was a empty lot that was formerly a gas station. And a developer had planned to build a housing, I think it was like 3 or 4 stories housing unit. And he was entitled for the project, had all the approvals, he was about to start. Somehow there was I can't recall the origins, but there was a battle to save that corner for open space. And so many people, including myself, got interested in that. And we thought that is true. You know, that corner would be perfect for open space because it's right, you know, you can think of Columbus Avenue, you have Washington Square, you would have that park, you would have, you know, the park down at the Cannery. So that seemed kind of a nice collection of parks. And the view corridor from that intersection of Columbus and Lombard was just fantastic. You know, you open that up, you see Coy Tower, St. Peter and Paul, Lombard Street, all of that. So there was this big battle led by the time by Supervisor Peskin and the neighborhood Telegraph Hill dwellers. And there was a vote to seize that property by eminent domain and for open space. And that won, but I think barely won vote at the board. So everybody's very happy. And suddenly, when the library bond wanted to, you know, renovate the library, the existing library was a mid-century modernist building that, you know, I found, as I mentioned, extremely well done. Beautiful building, very interesting, open floor plan, with just a beautiful building when it first opened. So I had a great, you know, fondness for it. So I said, well, that's great. Renovation, expansion, that would be nice. Then suddenly, somewhere in that process, there was a committee meeting for the library, and there was this giant multi-$1,000 model. And instead of a renovation, there was a new library built on the corner where the park was. So my first reaction, wait a minute, the property was seized by eminent domain for open space. How can you build a building on it when the previous entitled housing project was denied and seized for open space? And the argument, well, this is the perfect location for the library because it opens up the playground more. I said, well, that's not the point. The point is, aren't there some legal, you know, underpinnings here about building a park? Anyway, that led to several of us in the neighborhood organizing to fight that and actually filed a lawsuit because it wasn't that we are against a library, new library. We wanted a renovation and an open space. So we did all these drawings and arguments, and I did a drawing showing that, well, you renovated the old library, expanded it down into the basement, added an addition, you would have several thousand square feet more of library space, plus save $1 million or more that you could use to, you know, build a technology center, for instance. Anyway, so we made all these arguments, filed a lawsuit on an environmental basis, and lost. We couldn't believe it, because the court said, well, it doesn't matter if you took the property for open space. You can change your mind. That seems to defy all logic. Under that kind of argument, you could do anything. And, you know. So anyway, the new library was built, and people were, so the Library Commission and others, advocates for it, came on, it's going to be beautiful. So at least one thing we did as a group, we argued that, well, at least put more windows in. So originally, if you look at the building, they have these slotted windows. Well, originally they were going to be very thin slot. At least we argued and got them wider. So if you see wider windows, you'll see that's because of our fight. But after the building opened, people started asking me, why is this library so small and no tables? And I said, because you can't fit things into a triangle very efficiently. So then we started having a lot of people wonder, you know, how did it happen? You know, I said, well, it was politics. You know, people just couldn't read drawings or look at a rendering and not understand that if you put an ant on the very corner with a perspective, it looks bigger than it is. Because in reality, everybody was just surprised how small. And the old library, even though it was smaller, felt much bigger. And if you added to that, we would have a much better building. and also the North Beach Library later was put on the National Register for the Historic Places, which we fought for during the process to highlight its architectural significance. And so the state of California and the federal, historic nominations committees agreed that this was a significant mid-modernist building. So we lost something.
Can't win them all.
No.
Well, we could go on and on. There's so many interesting things you've done. One thing I do want to maybe close with is Next Village.
Yes.
Which is, have you been helping to form that group? What is your involvement with it?
Well, my attachment to Next Village started when Joni Levy and Janet Crane of our neighborhood saw an interesting model in Boston called Beacon Hill Village, where seniors living in their community started helping each other and formed a group called a village, where volunteers would be sought. They would help each other. They started a group. So about 17 years ago, I joined that board as a founding board member, and because I said, that makes so much sense. Like many things that I've kind of become attached to, it seemed so obvious that you needed certain things, and one of them was seniors, neighbors helping neighbors, because there are people who aren't low income enough to afford, to have government assistance, and too much, they have too much income or wealth or savings to qualify for, the very low end of society, and they're not rich enough to buy, assisted services. So anyway, it's something that I think is, very important. It's grown in our neighborhood, and it's going to be needed throughout this country as aging population
Are you
grows.
on the board, or?
Yes, I'm on the board, right.
Okay.
So I've been on the board since it was founded. So it's a really important group, I think.
Does Next Village work in tandem with, or is it completely separate from San Francisco Village?
Yeah, there are villages. There are many, many villages in the Bay Area now. We were one of the first, if not the first, and they're all over the country. So it's kind of like a neighborhood or a community, or even a cluster of a building or two could form their own village. So it's an organization that advocates for their membership, or people, not necessarily members. Next Village in San Francisco, we provide huge amount of service content in terms of educational courses. We do trips, outings, luncheons, language classes, book readings. So if you go on Next Village SF website, you'll see this whole calendar of events which are actually open to everyone. And that's part of the service we give, not only to seniors, but a lot of other people.
And I just want to also close with talk a little bit about your family. So we're kind of going back full circle to where we started the conversation. Your parents, I think, are no longer with us. Is that right?
Well, my mother is still alive.
She is?
Yes.
Oh, terrific.
Yeah, 96.
Where does she live?
She lives upstairs in this building here.
I think your father was in the Army, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. That was how many families started. My father was in the Army, and after the war, many Chinese American soldiers went back to China and brought, their future wives here, because as you know, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, or whatever, prevented Chinese immigration in this country. Very dark part of our history. And it was only because of World War II, when China became an ally of the United States, that led to the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, allowing Chinese immigration. And one of the first things was the War Brides Act, where a lot of Chinese Americans could go back and bring a bride
Oh,
back.
so he was here and then he went back and he brought your mother back.
Yes,
I
yes.
see. And where did he serve?
Well, let's see. I can't remember where he went to boot camp, but he was towards the end of the war. He served in the Japanese occupational forces. I think in Fukuoka, I think it was. So it was kind of an interesting experience, he said, to look at, these enclosures, and he would see Japanese prisoners of war, and they would look at him and kind of say, who's he? So that was kind of interesting, he said.
Yeah. And then, so he learned English pretty well. Has your mother learned English?
No, actually, you'll probably find a lot of older Chinese people in San Francisco still don't speak much English, especially in Chinatown. You actually really did have a truly insular village. So a lot of my relatives, older relatives, do not speak much English. My father, growing up somewhat in Stockton and Sacramento and San Francisco, did speak English. So
and he was in the work world.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And then you have two sisters, right?
Yes.
Are they living in the Bay Area?
Yeah, they both live in the area. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we've covered a lot.
Well,
have you stayed in touch with any of the people that grew up in the neighborhood when you were growing up, like Ralph or any of the
no,
other
not
people you
really.
went to school with?
Well, interestingly, a lot of the people, say, on this street alone, have gone on to very. I always say that the post-baby war, baby boom generation is a very remarkable generation. So when you look at, there were two police chiefs who grew up in alleys in San Francisco. One of them was Fred Lau. He grew up on Varennes Street on the other side of this block. Chief Heather Fong grew up on Banham Place, another alley off of Green and Grant. And on this street, many of my neighbors who, when you're growing up, you think, they're not going to amount to much. Well, a lot of them have done very well. My next door neighbor is very wealthy mechanical engineer, salesman. I have a couple of neighbors who were in tech. I haven't kept up with them, but I was very surprised that they became such successful tech people. And the street has had a whole host of very interesting creative people. There have been writers, artists, filmmakers. Gary Kamaya, the journalist, lives up the block. We have a couple of contractors here who are doing very well, and restaurateurs. So that post-World War II baby boom generation, when you look back at the days of Garfield Grammar School, Francisco Middle School, Galileo High School, and you think, all those people who didn't know what they were already going, well, a lot of people have done very well, contributed to a society. So it's a great, great motto, I think, for our future.
I want to thank you so much, Howard.
Thank you.
This has been terrific.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.